All right. Well, let's get started then. I'm really pleased to present this, our first of three sessions here in the tech track. We're really excited to have this conversation because, we often think about all the content that we create has to be stored somewhere. What are we thinking about the sustainability angles as it relates to storage? And as I learned attending an event last year at Fujifilm, that tape is possibly a great contender for a sustainability angle. So we're going to dive into that, and we have Linda Paddock with us, who is the CEO of Digital Bedrock. She's an award-winning archivist, and she's going to lead this conversation. So I will hand it over to you, Linda.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Is my sound on?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Barbara, and thank you, everyone who's attending this session. Now, the title of the session kind of references that maybe tape is old, but it's really the same age as spinning disk, as hard drives. And the speakers and I just wanted to be sure we pointed that out. Tape has always been a part of storage infrastructure strategies. So data tape should really be included in any discussion on sustainability and the environment. Several studies, especially just recently, have pointed out that the vast majority of data that's being stored today is actually archival, like up to 80% of it is just archival, but it's being kept for potential future unknown use, or it's kept simply because the data managers don't want to deal with the complexities of figuring out, okay, what do we want to keep? How long do we want to retain it? How should we dispose of it and when? So if the majority of data is archival, then there's no need to keep it on spinning disk or flash storage devices for two reasons. Reason one is that storing data on spinning disk and flash storage not only use more energy, as I'm sure you all know already, it uses more energy than just storing data on tape, which can just, once it's written, can sit on the shelf, happily wait there until it's time to be used. But the thing with storing the spinning disk and flash storage is not only the energy use, but they also emit more CO2 emissions throughout their entire life cycle. And the life cycle being from the point of manufacturing to the use, to the secondary use, and then ultimately to e-waste when it is disposed. The second reason why you don't need to keep your data on spinning disk and flash storage is it's projected that there will be zettabytes, if not yottabytes, of data being consumed and created and stored globally within the next 20 years or even less. And there's just simply not enough natural earth resources available to keep creating those data storage devices, the spinning disk and the solid state drives, ad infinitum. There's just simply not, we're going to run out. And the storage media reclamation processes are still in their infancy. And in addition, there will be water shortages around the world, as there already are, as you're all familiar with. That's going to impact chilling those data centers where the cloud operates. And the cloud is primarily operating on top of spinning disk and solid state drives. And especially lately in the news here in the US, there's been news about the area around Phoenix, Arizona, which has become a data center hub. And now the city has put down restrictions on housing developments in the area because of water shortages. So there's this competition, not just in Arizona, but I know like in Taiwan and in Singapore, around the world, between the water use from the data centers or from the manufacturing plants for the NAND storage devices and people who need that water. So this is only going to become worse over time. So our speakers are going to address these topics and many more. Our session format is going to be, so each speaker who follows me will have 5 minutes to present on whatever topic they would like to discuss. And then it will be followed by a panel discussion with all of us. And after that, we'll open up the floor for like the last 5 minutes or so of the session to your questions. So I encourage you, as we go through this session, add your questions into the chat and we will address them at the end. So let's get going here. So our first speaker up is Sean Broom. Sean has been in the tape industry for over 20 years, participating in the implementation of LTO1. I'm so impressed. I mean, that was the beginning of LTO. His current position is as a market strategist and analyst internal to IBM, assisting clients and business leaders in understanding the tape market dynamics. So over to you, Sean.
Well, thank you, Linda. And you brought up a lot of the key points that are really important when talking about the technical aspects of tape. not just in relation to sustainability, which sustainability is a word that covers a large gambit of technical and really emotional and social aspects. So when we look at the technical aspects of tape media from a sustainability point of view, we not only have those reductions in energy, which we talk about what you just said, restrictions in water, but also we're going to start seeing restrictions in the grid. If you're going to continue to reduce energy consumption, CO2e, you either have to go to a strategy of carbon dioxide reduction overall, so a commitment to something like nuclear energy, or you have to look at just reducing the overall consumption. Tape, of course, plays an unbelievable role in energy reduction or consumption in relation to longevity of data. A lot of data, 50 to 60% of data, as you indicated, goes into an archival state, and keeping it on disk just isn't reasonable for larger amounts of that data. But longevity has to go into the longevity of the media. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to put it on tape because tape consumes less energy. Longevity of media has to work into that play so that you don't have to remount and access data, move it around, and dispose of it. On average, most financial obligations show that tape media is used between 9 and 12 years, which is anywhere from 3 to 5 times longer than what most HDD media has been traditionally used and is planned for use. Now, we do see that some of them go a little bit longer, but so does tape media. We have clients that have seen reasonable and capable access of all their data within the bit error rate, of course, which is up in the 1 exabyte per failure range, using that media for 20 years. And that right there is a huge compliment to the technological foundations behind tape media. The underlayments, the composite and magnetic materials utilized, which Rich is going to talk about here in a couple of minutes, are very stable over a long period of time. Therefore, being able to take data, put it on tape, know that it is preserving humanity's history, right? Just preserving that data and preserving it in a state that's offline and air-gapped, which is just as important within the management of all of the aspects related to data. So that creates that capability to take data, put it on tape. Tape's longevity means you don't have to consume energy. You can take it offline, reduce the e-waste. There are processes to recycle 98% of an entire tape infrastructure. So right there, we begin to show reductions in CO2. Now, we do have lots of data related to where CO2 originates, the CO2e, the equivalent of, because that's the standardized measurement today, available from the tape market. So it's not just puff and fluff marketing stuff. There's hard numbers that show when you start to bring energy consumption down over the usage or longevity of that data, that you reduce the energy, or you reduce the infrastructure contribution, which is called embedded carbon. And ultimately, the end of life is very, very small in CO2e because most of it is recyclable. And that really goes back to those key points. It saves 97% of energy during operations for data that's in archival state. It reduces the CO2e related to data by about 96%, even for small users. We're not talking about giant users with hundreds of petabytes of data. We're talking about users even down in the hundreds of terabytes. 99%, 98 to 99% of the materials have a recyclable process. As an earth structure, we have to get better at just recycling in general, but if your products are made to where they can have a process of recyclability, that is great. And what we found is, because from a technical point of view, and again, Rich is going to go into this a little bit here in a minute, because of the technical capabilities of tape, it can store more data within the footprint of a single tape than HDDs may be able to ever hold on a single HDD. So we have 50 terabytes coming around the corner very quickly in tape, whereas HDDs working very hard to get to 30 terabytes. So we'll leave it at that. There's a lot of technical information that go into the background, so hopefully this sparks questions and interest, and I'll pass it to you to turn over to Rich.
Thank you, Sean. Boy, I have some questions for you. Okay, but let's go on to Rich. Rich Gadomski. Rich is head of tape evangelism for Fujifilm Recording Media USA, based out of Valhalla, New York. Rich has more than 30 years of experience in the data storage industry. So, Rich, looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks very much, Linda. Good morning, Sean, and thanks, Barbara, and everybody for attending. Linda, you're absolutely correct. A lot of the cloud is based on Flash and HDD, but the good news is that the cloud service providers are also adopting tape storage, particularly for their cold and archival services. And according to industry analyst Trend Focus, in fact, the hyperscalers are the fastest growing market segment for tape. And, I believe it's because of the very simple value proposition that tape has in terms of lowest energy consumption, so lowest CO2e emissions for any storage device. It is the greenest form of storage. Low TCO, lowest total cost of ownership. As Sean alluded to, very, very high density, very long archival life, excellent reliability. So those are some of the highlights, but definitely the hyperscalers recognize the value proposition, and we believe the broader marketplace is continuing to adopt tape. So that's great news. Tape has been around for 70 years, but there's been a tremendous amount of development, actually more development in terms of capacity and transfer rate, improvements in reliability just in the last 20 years. If you look at LTO, for example, which was introduced in 2000, it was at just 100 gigabytes with 20 megabytes per second transfer rate. And that was based on what we called legacy metal particle tape. So today, fast forward to 2023, we're at LTO 9 with 18 terabytes of capacity. And that's a 180x increase over what LTO 1 was just 23 years ago. Transfer rates have also increased as much as 20x from 20 megabytes per second to 400 megabytes per second. We've also transitioned the underlying technology of the media. We went from legacy metal particle in the early days of LTO, and that was similar to what was used in the 90s for DLT, for example. But we realized that if we're going to continue to increase the areal density and therefore the capacity, that we needed a smaller magnetic particle. So when you take legacy metal particle and you reduce it in size, a funny thing happens. You lose magnetic signal strength and you lose long-term archivability. So we had to find a new particle, and that became barium ferrite, which we introduced and demoed to the market with IBM in 2006. And we were at 6.6 billion bits per square inch. which I'll give you some sense of how still large a particle that is. And that would allow for 8 terabytes of storage capacity on a single LTO size cartridge. Barium ferrite eventually came to market by 2012, and that became standard in LTO6 and LTO7, and is in fact the de facto standard for LTO tapes today and IBM Enterprise tapes as well. But in 2020, we also introduced a demonstration with IBM for the next generation particle, which is even smaller than barium ferrite with excellent long-term archivability, no loss of magnetic signal strength. And that's what we call strontium ferrite. So in 2020, the demo was 580 terabytes of native capacity, still on an LTO size, palm size data cartridge. Sean alluded to HDD capacities getting up to 30, 50 terabytes. Well, we went way past that with 580 terabytes. And in fact, the LTO roadmap was extended. It's currently at generation 9. It was extended to generation 14, which would allow for 576 terabytes of native capacity, over 1.4 petabytes compressed. So that's strontium ferrite, which is a future magnetic particle. And even beyond strontium ferrite, we are working on and currently developing the next future generation particle, which we call epsilon ferrite. And epsilon ferrite will allow for over 1 petabyte native capacity. So I mentioned, okay, so with the areal density, the demo that we did for 580 terabytes in December of 2020 was only 318 billion bits per square inch. Now, why do I say only? Because the HDD industry is already, the HDDs are already at 1 trillion bits per square inch. And yet our 580 terabyte demo was at 319 billion. So about 30% of where HDD is today. So what that means is that tape has a lot of headroom, or a long runway, if you will, to continue to increase areal density before we run into the same kind of challenges that the HDD industry has today, which is the superpower magnetic limitation, where the smaller the particles get, they can't maintain their signal strength. So fortunately, we don't have that problem in tape. We have a long runway ahead of us, huge potential capacities in the future. And of course, those capacities continue to be a huge benefit in terms of energy consumption, also total cost of ownership, the density, floor space that Sean mentioned. So, currently using barium ferrite, strontium ferrite will be the next step, even epsilon ferrite in the future. So we're very excited about the technology, the fact that it doesn't have any fundamental limitations in terms of increasing capacity. And again, that's really, really important as the market is experiencing exponential data growth. And nobody wants to delete anything. It's like indefinite data storage. Yet 75, as you mentioned, Linda, 80% of data eventually goes cold. 75%, 80%, the numbers vary, but most data does go cold. So why would you keep that on energy-intensive spinning disk? And we believe this is not about tape versus disk. We need disk, we need tape, we need flash. Cloud is a great storage option, but cloud is based on these technologies. But when data goes cold, can't be deleted, has future value. I mean, think of the media entertainment space. They will never really want to delete any of that original entertainment content. But life sciences, there's just, it goes on and on. Cultural heritage. So a lot of those retention periods are indefinite. HPC, the research community. So we believe we have a solution for, when data goes cold, infrequently accessed, move it from disk, flash to tape, reduce your energy consumption, reduce your total cost of ownership, And that's what's needed for the environment. Data centers are energy intensive. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Rich. Okay, and thanks, Sean. So we don't have any questions in the chat yet. So before we start the discussion, I just want to remind everybody, if you do have questions, please add them to the chat so we can address them. But first, we will start with a discussion amongst us all. So Rich and Sean, you both mentioned generations, of course. And so one of the issues of people who are reluctant to use data tape as storage, they say, well, gosh, what about this whole generation? You have to migrate between generations. Sean mentioned that the longevity of data is that people tend to use tape every 9 to 10 years, while a couple of generations might have passed during that time period. And so I want to open that up to both of you to discuss. How would you present, an argument against or to the people saying like, no, don't worry about the generations, that there's a way to handle that. Anyway, opening it up to both of you.
Sean, please.
Yeah, generational migration it's something that I'm laughing because I just wrote a blog on this exact topic. Generational migrations are extremely important within digital longevity. Provenance of data is very hard to track. And in the longevity of tape, you have the ability to check data without retrieving it. So you can actually go out there on the tape and the tape knows exactly how it writes the data. So preserving provenance and having these tape migrations is exactly the same as the migration you do with HDDs, in that you're going to have to move the data. But doing it less has less of an impact on the administrative capabilities, right? Which are, our resource to manage this. It has less of an impact on the energy because you're not trying to move them as often. And it also has a much lower impact generationally on sustainability, mainly because every time it's not the trend yet. Hopefully this will become the trend where I'm going here. Every time we remove data from a technology today, we destroy the technology. We have it crushed because we just don't want that data to be accessed. And all of a sudden that contributes to our polluting. I don't really want to say polluting because some of it can get recycled, but most of it doesn't. But certainly to our contribution in CO2e. So in longevity, a lot of people get scared by saying, well, the migration makes sure that I can check my data and I can move it. But that's not a factor with tape because tape doesn't have bit rot as HDD and others may have. And number two, as a big factor, as I started out saying, you can actually take a tape, mount it to a drive and say, hey, just go read that whole tape. And verify the tape, and then just report with a thumbs up that says we're good, which gives the provenance, those that manage data at their core, confidence that, hey, I wrote it, I did a checksum, I verified the checksum, that checksum's not going to change. Therefore, I can now understand that I have great data. So generationally, tape offers wonderful capability to continue to go. And then the final thing in generations, and this is a big answer because it's a big question. The final concern is always, well, will I have tape drives to read that in 10 years? Will I actually be able to retrieve my data in 10 years? Well, from a industry standpoint, marketing of a tape drive released 12 years ago just stopped last year. Therefore, you're certainly going to have the ability to pull data back in 10 years, but probably much longer if you choose. Does that cover the whole gamut of that question? Linda? Because it is a pretty big question.
Oops, just a moment. I want to have Rich, Rich, do you have anything to reply to that? And then I'll come in after that.
Yeah, I would just add the reliability and the longevity factor to what Sean had to say, that we've done accelerated life testing on media. We had originally tested it up to 30 years, but now since LTO 7, LTO 7, 8, and 9 are now rated at 50 years in terms of longevity. Not that you would have the drives around that long, but it just shows you how stable the medium is. And Sean mentioned bit rot. In fact, today tape has the best bit error rate. It's described as 1 × 10 to the 20th power. And that's several orders of magnitude better than what you'll see in flash or HDDs. So the longevity, reliability are certainly not a factor. And you know, it certainly supports the time periods between migrations.
Well, it's interesting. So we're talking about longevity of the media itself, which can go on, as you said, or tests up to 50 years. But then there is the issue of drives. And so you need to have drives to be able to read that media back. And so there's only one manufacturer of drives, that's IBM. There's 2 manufacturers of the LTO tape, you know, Sony and Fujifilm. But let's talk about drives for a moment. So there are, I think the most recent or the oldest generation drive that is still being manufactured is LTO 6. So if you want anything earlier than that, LTO 5 or earlier, you have to have refurbished drives to do that. So I think that, just to play devil's advocate here, so even if the tape can go on for like 10 years, or people use it for 10 years or even longer than that, they might not be able to find drives to read that data back. So would either of you like to address that problem?
Sure. So that's kind of what I was talking to. If you look at when LTO 6 was introduced, that was over a decade ago. So you're already at your 10 years. You're going to be able to read data you put on there 10 years ago. Now, if you're just migrating to LTO 6, you could see some complications, but extreme late adoption usually comes around some financial consideration. I want to save a couple of bucks, and it really comes down to that. But I think, I don't think, if you look at the statistics, it's pretty easy to find a drive, whether it's refurbished or brand new. You find a lot of new drives, even older ones, on the market. Most customers will have drives available. And that is part of that 10-year migration that we recommend because it's a financial. But the bigger elephant was the first one that you said, well, only one drive manufacturer in the world. Okay, yeah, there's one drive manufacturer in the world, being IBM, which is fairly well known, but the source of parts to those drives have multiple vendors. So the components related to that come from multiple vendors, meaning you have continuity of supply. And it is correct that the capacity of scale has driven the market down to one vendor rather than one supplier. But this is not wholly related just to tape. HDDs are down to, we could say 2, but let's just say 3, depending on how you financially look at that arrangement going on. If you have an LED TV in your office or in your house, which almost everybody does, whether it's LED or LCD, there's only 2 manufacturers of those technically. All of the core materials are 2 manufacturers. So it's a scale thing.
Okay, Sean, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's 2 minutes left in our session. We can move over to another speaker area, I'm told, but we do have one question in the chat. Can Rich and Sean, can you see that? Would either of you like to?
Yeah. Ben, that's a great question. Yeah, I'll go ahead and take it. Ben, that's a great question. I'll be very quick. The question is, what's the average time to access a specific piece of data on a cartridge? If the cartridge is mounted, the average time is 40 seconds. And that is just travel time to the middle of the tape to get to first byte on data. And then you retrieve the data at up to 400 megabytes per second. Now, there's ways to improve multiple pieces of data being retrieved, but your average time to data is 40 seconds, which is halfway down the tape. You can get to any piece of data on average right around there. And if it needs to be fetched from storage, it's got to be mounted. It depends on what the storage is. But most libraries mount within 10 seconds. So you're under a minute to your average time to first data access.
Okay, we need to stop here. I'm sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Linda, Rich, and Sean, for your participation. It's a topic that I think deserves obviously longer discussion and is critically important as part of the sustainability effort.